In the summer of 2022, a commercial real estate listing appeared on the Montezuma, Iowa city website. 80,000 square feet, 2 acres, a large industrial building on South Front Street, price reduced to $525,000. The listing noted that the previous occupant had relocated to the Chicago area. It did not say much else. What it did not say was that this building had stood for more than half a century as one of the most recognized addresses in American hobby history. That the smell of fresh-cut balsa wood had drifted from its loading dock every weekday morning for decades. That modelers in 48 states had thumbed through the catalog that was printed and shipped from this building and called it, without irony, their wish book. It did not say that the woman who started all of it, in a basement, with a $200 loan and a table saw, had grown up playing in the field where this building now stood. The listing sat there for months. No one bought it. This is the story of SIG Manufacturing, Montezuma, Iowa, and what a small town loses when the thing that made it matter finally leaves. To understand what SIG Manufacturing meant to Montezuma, Iowa, you have to understand what Montezuma was before SIG existed. A county seat in the middle of the state, population just over 1,000, surrounded by cornfields in every direction. A town where people knew each other by first name, where the same families had worked the same trades for generations, and where the idea that something made here could be sold to people in California or New York or Florida would have seemed, in 1950, like a pleasant kind of fantasy. Glenn Sigafus was not from Montezuma originally. He had worked as a linotype operator, the kind of man who could read metal type backwards as easily as you read words forward. And he had eventually landed at the Montezuma Republican, the local paper, where he became shop foreman. Hazel Hicks had watched him work the linotype from across the street. She learned the machine just by watching him through the window. When they finally met, she was faster on it than he was. He was not threatened by this. He thought it was remarkable. They were married on January 23, 1943. Glenn had been a modeler most of his life. He had built rubber-powered planes as a boy in the 1920s, back when balsa wood was still a novelty in America, when most boys were building from bamboo and tissue and whatever scraps of light wood they could find. By the time he met Hazel, his interest had moved through control line and into the early days of radio control, a hobby so new that most of the country had never heard of it. Practiced by a scattered community of obsessives who built everything by hand and considered that entirely the point. What Glenn understood, and what almost nobody else in the hobby had yet organized around, was a simple logistical problem. Modelers across the country needed balsa. Good balsa, properly dried, consistently cut, graded for weight and grain, and most of them had no reliable way to get it. Local hobby shops were sparse. Mail order was primitive. If you lived outside a major city, you were largely on your own. In 1951, Glenn and Hazel borrowed $200. They bought a table saw. They put it in the basement of their home in Montezuma, Iowa, and Glenn began cutting balsa sheets and sticks by hand while Hazel packaged and shipped them. They placed a classified advertisement in Model Airplane News magazine. They received no response at all. They tried again. This time they offered information about the balsa, grades, dimensions, availability, for the price of 10 cents. The requests came back by the hundreds. Within 5 years, SIG Manufacturing Company had outgrown the basement, outgrown a rented space, and purchased its first proper building. The table saw that started everything was moved into the new facility and placed near the entryway, where it would remain for the next 7 decades. Not as a museum piece, not behind glass, but simply present, the way a founding object sometimes stays in a room long after everyone has stopped consciously noticing it. What followed was the kind of growth that looks inevitable only in retrospect. Glenn recruited model designers, serious builders, men with reputations in the hobby community, to develop an exclusive line of SIG kits. He expanded the catalog beyond balsa to include engines, hardware, adhesives, covering materials, and finished kits from other manufacturers. Hazel ran the business side with the same precision she had brought to the linotype machine, methodical, fast, and absolutely unwilling to let a mistake stand uncorrected. By the mid-1950s, SIG was importing raw balsa logs directly from Ecuador and plywood from Finland, processing them in-house and shipping finished materials to modelers across the country. The operation was vertically integrated in a way that most small manufacturers never achieved. SIG did not just sell balsa. SIG controlled the balsa, from the South American forest to the Iowa basement to the workbench in a hobbyist's garage in Ohio. There was one detail about the SIG facility that the company never particularly advertised, but that people in Montezuma all knew. The building, the one that would eventually grow to 80,000 square feet, sat on the land where Hazel Sigafus had played as a girl. The house where she grew up was directly across the street. She had built a company on her own childhood ground, and every morning when she walked into work, she crossed the same field she had crossed as a child, running towards something she could not yet name. For a long time, that felt like the whole story. A dream planted in Iowa soil, growing exactly where it was supposed to. It was not the whole story. By the 1960s, the SIG catalog had become something that did not have a precise equivalent in American consumer culture. It was not quite a magazine and not quite a store. It was closer to a promise, thick, densely printed, arriving in the mailbox of a modeler in rural Kansas or suburban Michigan or coastal Maine with the reliable weight of something that mattered. Hobbyists called it the wish book, the same word their parents had used for the Sears catalog, and they meant it the same way. You sat down with it at the kitchen table and you did not get up for a long time. The catalog listed everything. Balsa sheets in every thickness, every grade, every cut. Spruce longerons, finished birch plywood, hardwood blocks, covering materials, dopes and thinners, adhesives mixed specifically for the stresses that model airframes endured, engines, wheels, landing gear wire, control horns, clevises, pushrod stock, and running through all of it the SIG kit line, scale aircraft, sport flyers, trainers, competition models. Each one designed by someone whose name the hobby community recognized. Each one documented with 3 view drawings and a parts list that a serious builder could evaluate at a glance. The operation that produced all of this ran across 80,000 square feet of floor space in Montezuma, Iowa. Raw balsa arrived as logs from Ecuador, was milled on site into sheets and sticks, graded by weight and grain, cut to dimension, and packed for shipment. The plywood came from Finland already processed, but was cut and shaped in-house. The paint and fuel division manufactured SIG's own line of dopes, thinners, and glow fuels, products that carried the SIG name because Glenn Sigafus had decided early that if his customers needed something to build and fly model airplanes, SIG would make it rather than resell someone else's version. The workforce was not large by industrial standards, but it was stable in the way that small-town manufacturing operations sometimes achieve. People who had worked there for 10 years, then 20, then longer, who knew the machines and the materials and each other with the particular intimacy that comes from doing precise physical work alongside the same people for most of your adult life. To work for SIG, as one profile of the company put it, meant joining the SIG family. Glenn and Hazel used first names. They knew who had a sick child at home and who was saving for a new truck. The payroll was modest. The loyalty ran both directions. At the center of SIG's product identity was a single airplane that the hobby community would eventually regard as one of the most important trainer designs ever produced in America. The Cadet had been in the SIG lineup since the early years, and in successive versions it taught more beginning RC pilots to fly than perhaps any other kit in the country. The Cadet Senior, the most widely known variant, was a high-wing trainer with forgiving flight characteristics, a wide landing gear stance that absorbed the rough arrivals of inexperienced pilots, and a construction sequence that a first-time builder could follow without previous woodworking experience. Clubs across the country kept cadets in their flight training programs as a matter of course. Instructors recommended them without hesitation. The airplane had a reputation that manufacturers spend decades trying to build and almost never achieve, a reputation for being genuinely trustworthy. What the Cadet represented, and what SIG at its peak represented, was a particular vision of what the hobby was supposed to be. You started with a box of raw materials. You read the plans, you cut the wood and pinned it to the building board and shaped the ribs and sheeted the leading edge and covered the finished structure with a material that you ironed down until it pulled tight and smooth. You learned something in the process, about aerodynamics, about structure, about the relationship between weight and strength, about patience and precision, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that would eventually fly. The hobby was the building as much as the flying. SIG's entire catalog was organized around that belief. The annual SIG fly-in at Montezuma drew modelers from across the country. People drove from neighboring states and some flew in from further away, arriving in a small Iowa town that had no particular reason to attract visitors except that SIG was there. They flew their airplanes in the Iowa sky and walked through the facility and talked to Hazel and Glenn and Mike Gretz, the R&D chief who had come to SIG in 1972 and whose name appeared in the credits of kit designs the way a film director's name appears on a poster, as a signal of a particular standard. For the hobbyists who made the trip, Montezuma was not a destination you explained to people outside the hobby. It was a place you either understood or you didn't. Glenn Sigafus died in 1980, performing at an air show above Centerville, Iowa. He was doing what he loved in the most literal sense available to a man who had spent 30 years building and flying model airplanes, and then full-scale ones. The loss was sudden, and it was severe. SIG had been built by 2 people operating as a single unit, and now one of them was gone. What happened next said something important about Hazel Sigafus that the catalog never could. She bought Glenn's half of the company. She cleared the firm's debt within 2 years. She kept the doors open, kept the catalog in print, kept the Balsa moving from Ecuador to Iowa to hobbyists in 48 states. She did this quietly, without announcing that it was remarkable, because to her it was simply what needed to be done. The wish book kept arriving in mailboxes. The cadets kept flying. None of the modelers who opened those catalogs in the early 1980s had any reason to think the world that produced them was already beginning to change. It was. The change did not arrive with the announcement. It never does. It arrived the way most market disruptions arrive in industries built on craft and tradition, gradually, then everywhere at once. And by the time the people most affected understood what was happening, the window for an easy response had already closed. Through the 1980s, SIG had continued to operate on the model that had built it. You ordered from the catalog arrived in the mail. You built the airplane. The hobby rewarded patience and skill, and the community that practiced it was self-selecting. People who genuinely wanted to spend 200 hours with a building board and a razor plane and a bottle of SIG's own aliphatic resin glue. The cadet kept producing new pilots. The fly-ins kept drawing crowds to Montezuma. The Balsa kept moving. But the demographics of that community were shifting in ways that did not show up immediately in the order books. The modelers who had grown up in the 1950s and 1960s, who had learned the hobby when building was inseparable from flying, were aging. Their children and grandchildren had grown up in a different world, one with video games and personal computers and an accelerating culture of instant results that made a 200-hour kit build feel less like a rewarding investment and more like an obstacle between wanting to fly and actually flying. The hobby industry noticed this. And in the early 1990s, manufacturers in Asia, primarily in China and Taiwan, began producing what the industry called almost ready-to-fly aircraft, ARFs. A modeler could order one, remove it from the box, install a radio system and an engine, and be flying within a weekend. No building board, no razor plane, no careful study of a 3-view drawing, no hours of pinning ribs to a plan sheet and waiting for glue to cure. Just a finished airframe, pre-covered, pre-hinged, ready for final assembly. The prices were, by the standards of American-manufactured kits, startlingly low. An ARF that would have cost twice as much to build from a domestic kit was suddenly available through distributors for a fraction of what SIG charged for raw materials alone. The quality was inconsistent at first. Warped wings, misaligned control surfaces, hardware that failed earlier than it should have. But it improved, steadily and quickly, in the way that offshore manufacturing tends to improve once the volume justifies investment in tooling and quality control. For a company like SIG, the ARF revolution presented a problem with no clean solution. SIG's identity was inseparable from the building process. The catalog existed to supply builders. The kit designs existed to guide builders. The cadet existed to teach builders. If a significant portion of the incoming generation of RC pilots did not want to build, if they wanted to fly, and considered building an inefficient means to that end, then SIG's entire value proposition was pointed at a market that was contracting in real time. The response was not wrong exactly. SIG began adding ARFs to its lineup, sourcing finished airframes and selling them under the SIG name. But the margins on ARFs were thin in ways that domestic kit production had never been, and the competitive field was crowded with distributors who had established relationships with overseas factories that SIG could not easily replicate. SIG was attempting to compete in a market that had been specifically designed to undercut the business model that SIG had spent 40 years building. Meanwhile, the retail infrastructure that had carried SIG's catalog to its customers was deteriorating. The independent hobby shop, the local dealer where a modeler could browse the SIG catalog, handle the kits, talk to someone who actually flew, was closing at a rate that alarmed everyone in the industry and surprised almost no one. The big box retailers that replaced them did not carry SIG's full line. Mail order and early internet sales helped, but they also introduced price competition that squeezed margins further and disconnected the product from the community context that had always been part of its appeal. Hazel and Maxie Hester, who had run the company together through the 1980s and into the 1990s, made the decision that many founders eventually make when the business they built has outlived the conditions that made it possible. In 1998, they sold SIG Manufacturing and retired. Hazel was 76 years old. She had run the company through Glenn's death, through debt, through the early years of the ARF disruption, through 4 decades of catalog production and fly-ins and cadet kits shipped to hobbyists who would never visit Montezuma, but who felt in some way they could not quite articulate that they knew the place. She had earned the retirement. Nobody who understood what she had carried would have argued otherwise. What the sale left behind, however, was a company whose identity had been almost entirely embodied in the people who founded it, and whose new ownership would have to navigate a market in active disruption without the institutional knowledge, the community relationships, or the founding conviction that had carried SIG through every previous difficulty. The catalog kept printing. The orders kept coming in, reduced in volume but still present. The building on South Front Street still smelled of balsa in the mornings. But the real problem had not announced itself yet. It was already inside the building, patient as the Iowa winter outside, waiting for the moment when the weight of it could no longer be ignored. The years between Hazel's retirement and the summer of 2022 are not well documented in the public record. SIG Manufacturing continued to operate under subsequent ownership, continued to produce kits and ARFs and balsa materials, continued to maintain the Montezuma facility that had been its home since the 1950s. The catalog survived, reduced from its peak thickness but still recognizable. The Cadet was still in the lineup. The SIG name still carried weight in the hobby community. The way old names sometimes carry weight long after the conditions that created them have changed. But weight is not the same as momentum, and a name is not the same as a direction. What the hobby community could observe from the outside, through the forum posts and dealer communications and order fulfillment patterns that constitute the informal intelligence network of any specialized hobby, was a company that was gradually losing its footing without ever publicly acknowledging that anything was wrong. Catalog updates slowed, product introductions became infrequent. The annual fly-in, which had once drawn modelers from across the country to a small Iowa town with no other particular reason to visit, became a quieter event. The institutional energy that had characterized SIG at its peak, the sense that something important was being built and refined and sent out into the world, was harder to locate. The ARF market continued to expand. The balsa kit segment continued to contract. The independent hobby shop network continued to thin. Every pressure that had been building since the early 1990s kept building, and SIG, under ownership that lacked the founding family's particular combination of obsession and stubbornness, was not well positioned to absorb it. Then, in June of 2022, Herb Rizzo, a longtime figure in the SIG orbit who had been involved with the company in various capacities, announced that he had resumed ownership of SIG Manufacturing. He did not explain in detail what circumstances had required him to do so. His statement to the community used the phrase "unfortunate circumstances" and moved quickly past it. What mattered, he suggested, was the future. SIG was reorganizing. SIG was relocating to a more modern facility. New products were coming for 2023, the legend would continue. The community received this news with the particular mixture of relief and unease that attaches to announcements that contain more reassurance than information. On the RC forums where hobbyists process developments like this in real time, the responses ranged from cautious optimism to open skepticism. People who had placed orders and not received them asked when their shipments would arrive. People who had been following the company for decades noted that the Montezuma facility, the 80,000 square foot building on South Front Street, the building where Hazel had walked to work across her childhood field for decades, had appeared on the local real estate market. The listing price was $550,000. It was then reduced to $525,000. The property was divided into 3 separate parcels for sale purposes, which suggested that the seller was prepared to take whatever the market would offer, in whatever configuration the market preferred. The market offered nothing, the building sat. On the Montezuma City website, in the section for available commercial properties, a brief notice appeared. It stated without elaboration that SIG Manufacturing, described as the leading processor of balsa, spruce, maple, basswood, and plywood, had moved to the Chicago area. Inquiries about the property should be directed to the listing agents. That was the announcement. No press release, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what 70 years in one place means to the people who live there. A city website entry, updated by someone in a municipal office, noting a change of address for a business that had defined the town's identity since before most of its current residents were born. For Montezuma, the departure of SIG was not a catastrophic economic event in the way that a large factory closure devastates a community built around a single employer. The town had survived and diversified across the decades. But there is a category of loss that is not purely economic, a loss of reference point, of the thing that answers the question strangers ask when they find out where you are from. Montezuma, Iowa, where the SIG factory is. Where Hazel Sigafus built her company on the field behind her childhood home, where the catalog came from, that answer no longer worked. The RC community's response online carried a particular kind of grief, not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the slower, heavier kind that comes from watching something diminish over a long period and finally accepting that the diminishment is permanent. Posts on RC Universe and similar forums noted that this was the same dynamic that had ended Top Flight, that had ended Great Plains, that had hollowed out the balsa kit segment of the hobby one company at a time. People who had learned to fly with a cadet in the 1970s or 1980s described what the SIG catalog had meant to them with the specificity that attaches to things encountered at the right age, when the world is still new enough that a wish book arriving in the mailbox can feel like a genuine visitation. The table saw that Glenn Sigafus had bought for $200 in 1951, the one that had sat in the entryway of the SIG facility for 7 decades, was somewhere in the process of being moved to Chicago with everything else. Whether it made the trip and where it ended up is not part of the public record. By the end of 2022, the only question Montezuma could reasonably ask was not whether SIG would return. It was whether the building would find a buyer before the town stopped checking. In January of 2023, the Academy of Model Aeronautics published its annual magazine with a feature story about Hazel Sig Hester. She had turned 100 years old the previous March, and the piece, written by a journalist who had traveled to Montezuma to spend time with her, was the kind of portrait that a life of that length and texture genuinely earns. It described the basement table saw and the 10-cent advertisement and Glenn's death over Centerville and the debt she had cleared in 2 years and the decades of catalogs and the fly-ins and the cadets and the way the SIG headquarters sat on the same ground where a girl named Hazel Hicks had played in the years before the Second World War. Herb Rizzo had given the journalist a tour of the facility during that visit. The R&D room, still full of prototypes and competition models, and the accumulated physical evidence of what SIG's designers had been working on across 5 decades. The wood processing area, where Balsa arrived from Ecuador and left as precisely dimensioned sheets and sticks. The kit assembly section, where wooden parts were arranged by kit number and boxed for shipment. Everyone was welcoming, the journalist wrote. The atmosphere was laid back and friendly. The fly-in that weekend was everything it had always been. Hobbyists gathering in a small Iowa town because SIG was there, and because SIG being there had always been enough of a reason. What the story did not say, because the story was a celebration and celebrations tend toward the present tense, was that the facility described in that article would not be in Montezuma much longer. The reorganization that Rizzo had announced 6 months earlier was underway. The Chicago relocation was not a rumor. The building on South Front Street was still on the market. The SIG that the journalist photographed and the modelers flew under that January was already, in the most material sense, in the process of leaving. There is a particular cruelty in that timing that does not require editorializing. The same month that the hobby community was invited to celebrate what SIG had built in Montezuma was the month in which SIG was quietly completing its departure from Montezuma. The centennial feature and the real estate listing existed simultaneously in the same January, pointing in opposite directions. Hazel herself was 100 years old. She had received the AMA's Presidential Achievement Award in 2022. The National Aeronautic Association had recognized her that same year as a Distinguished Stateswoman of Aviation, an honor given to women whose contributions to flight have shaped the field in ways that outlast their active participation in it. She was still living in Colorado, still lucid enough to share her stories with a journalist, still capable of describing the linotype machine and the basement saw, and Glenn riding into town on a motorcycle as if these were recent memories rather than events from 8 decades past. She had outlived her husband by more than 40 years. She had outlived her company's presence in the town where she built it. She had outlived the hobby shop network that had carried the SIG catalog to its customers. She had outlived the Balsa kit era that she and Glenn had helped create. And she was still here, at 100 years old, with the Presidential Achievement Award and the feature story and the memories intact. Watching from Colorado, while the building on her childhood field changed hands in a real estate transaction that generated no public ceremony whatsoever. In the years that followed, SIG under Rizzo's ownership in the Chicago area worked to rebuild its product line. The process was slower than the announcements had suggested. Orders were delayed. Communications from the company were intermittent in ways that frustrated customers who had been waiting. The forums documented this in the granular, patient, occasionally exasperated way that hobby communities document things that matter to them. People who had grown up with SIG gave the company the benefit of the doubt longer than they might have given a brand without that history, because the history was real and because the cadet and the catalog and the fly-ins were real, and loyalty to real things tends to outlast the conditions that originally generated it. By 2025, new kits were in production, the LT-40 and the Something Extra, new ARF designs. The website carried the announcement in capital letters, SIG is back, with the exclamation points that accompany resurrections, in business as in other contexts where the return from the difficult place needs to be marked as significant. In March and April of 2026, new aircraft were released, the Kiwi Sport Pattern and the Something Extra 60 size. The Cadet remained in the catalog. SIG Manufacturing was not dead. The name was intact. The product line was rebuilding. Herb Rizzo had done what he said he would do, or enough of it that the community had reason to believe the rest was coming. But it was doing all of this from Chicago. The 80,000 square feet in Montezuma, the building on Hazel's Field, the room where the table saw had sat for 7 decades. the facility that modelers from 48 states had associated with the SIG name since before most of them could drive, was a real estate listing, a commercial property available in 3 parcels, an address that no longer produced anything. On October 10, 2025, Hazel Lorene SIG Hester died at the age of 103. Her funeral was held at the First Presbyterian Evangelical Church in Montezuma. The AMA published a memorial. Model Aviation ran an obituary. The hobby community responded with the quiet, genuine grief that attaches to the loss of someone who has been present for so long that her absence rearranges the shape of the thing she helped build. She had been born on the 3rd day of the 3rd month in 1922 and had spent most of her long life within a few miles of the town where she grew up. The company she co-founded had outlived her. The building she had walked to across her childhood field had not. The gates did not close with a ceremony. There were no gates, technically, just a property listing, an updated city website, and a January magazine story that had arrived too late or too early depending on how you measured the distance between a celebration and an ending. The cadets are still flying, just not from Iowa. There is a photograph that appeared in the January 2023 issue of Model Aviation, taken during the journalist's visit to the SIG facility in Montezuma. It shows the table saw that Glenn Sigafus purchased in 1951 with $200 borrowed dollars. The saw that started everything, that processed the first balsa sheets in the basement, that was moved into the first building and placed near the entryway, and left there for 7 decades as the company grew around it. In the photograph, it is exactly where it had always been. Ordinary looking. Unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it was. That saw is in Chicago now, or it isn't, nobody has said. The building on South Front Street in Montezuma eventually found its resolution, though not in the way a building of that history might have deserved. The 80,000 square feet that once processed balsa from Ecuador and plywood from Finland and shipped the wish book to modelers in 48 states passed out of the SIG story the way industrial buildings usually do, quietly, transactionally, without the kind of acknowledgement that the decades inside them warranted. The field where Hazel played as a girl, where she walked to work every morning for the better part of her adult life, is now simply a piece of commercial real estate in a small Iowa county seat. The modelers who learned to fly with a cadet in the 1970s are in their 60s and 70s now. Some of them still fly. Some still build from kits. The patient minority who never entirely accepted the ARF proposition, who still believe that 200 hours with a building board produces something that a pre-covered airframe cannot replicate. They know what SIG was and what it represented. And they carry that knowledge with the particular weight that attaches to things you understood only after they were already changing. For Montezuma, the departure of SIG left the kind of absence that small towns accumulate slowly and feel permanently. Not a wound exactly. More like the way a room looks after you have moved the furniture out. The same dimensions, the same light coming through the same windows. But the proportions somehow different. The space organized around something that is no longer there to organize around. The town has its courthouse and its businesses and its people and its county fair. It does not have SIG anymore. The new SIG, the Chicago SIG, the rebuilt SIG, is real. The kits are in production. The website is active. The name carries enough historical weight that the community has reasons to stay interested, and Herb Rizzo has given those reasons substance by actually delivering product. The cadet, in some form, is still available to a beginning pilot who wants to learn the way beginning pilots learned in 1975. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, more than most of the brands that defined the American hobby kit era managed to preserve. But the SIG that was a place, that was a specific building in a specific town in central Iowa, where a woman who grew up across the street built something improbable and ran it for half a century and passed it on, that SIG is finished. It finished without a ceremony. It finished with a real estate listing and a city website update and a January magazine story that came out the same month the moving trucks were running. Hazel SIG Hester died in October 2025 at 103, having received every honor the hobby community knew how to give. The AMA, the National Aeronautic Association. The journalists who made the trip to Montezuma and sat with her and listened to the stories about Glenn and the motorcycle and the linotype machine and the 10-cent advertisement and the hundreds of letters that came back. She built a company on her own childhood field. She flew full-scale airplanes and built model ones and ran a business and cleared its debts and outlived her husband and her era and eventually her building. The catalog that hobbyists called the Wish Book is a digital presence now, reduced to a website and a product list. The Ecuador balsa and the Finnish plywood and the smell of fresh-cut wood in the morning are part of a building that belongs to someone else. The table saw is somewhere. On quiet mornings in Montezuma, the field where Hazel played is still there. The proportions are different now. The thing that was built on it came and grew and filled the horizon of a small Iowa town for 70 years, and then it moved to Chicago, and the field is just a field again. She always slowed down when she drove past it. Even at the end, she always slowed down.